There's a document sitting in a Yorkshire archive that says, in so many words, a man wasn't welcome anymore. Not because of anything he'd done, because of where he was born, decades before he was even old enough to have a say in it, tied to a piece of paper he probably never even knew existed. I found it while chasing something else entirely. A single line in a clerk's handwriting, and it stopped me cold because it answered a question this family had been asking for 4 generations without ever finding the right document to settle it. They just had no idea they were asking the question wrong the whole time. Let's dive in. Welcome to Ancestors and Algorithms, where family history meets artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Brian, and today we're heading somewhere I get asked about constantly and haven't actually taken you. England itself. Not an ancestor who left England for somewhere else and built a life across an ocean. England as the whole story, start to finish. Now, if you've got English roots, you already know the records exist. GRO, parish registers, all of it. What nobody warned you about is where some of the richest material actually lives, tucked away in a category most researchers never even learn the name of. It's called the parish chest, and most researchers walk right past it in their entire lives without ever knowing it's there waiting for them. So let's get started. Here's the family story, the version that got passed down. A young man moved to a new parish sometime in the 1830s to find work. And for reasons nobody could ever explain, he got sent back. Not asked to leave, sent. Officially, on paper, by people with the legal authority to make it happen. The family that remembered him mostly remembered that part. The sending back part. Told the way families tell these things. Bad luck, a bad employer, hard times. The same 3 explanations doing the work of an actual answer. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second. Hard times. Because it's true of basically every family from this era, and it explains nothing at all about this one man in this one parish in this one specific year. Some of you already know this feeling. Not this exact story, but the shape of it. A family legend everybody repeats and nobody can actually back up with a document. I hear versions of it constantly in my Facebook group. Somebody's grandmother definitely came from a certain village, except nobody's ever found her there in any surviving record. Somebody's great-grandfather was always a farmer, until the one record that survives says something else entirely. We inherit the conclusion. Somewhere along the way, we lose the evidence, and by the time we go looking for it, the person who could have explained it in one sentence has been gone for 100 years. This composite is built from exactly that pattern, the kind you'll find across thousands of English families from this period. I'm going to call him Amos Aveyard, born around 1815 somewhere in the West Riding of Yorkshire, most likely into a family of agricultural laborers or textile workers, the 2 occupations that dominated that part of Yorkshire in this era. It's worth remembering what that world actually looked like for someone like him. Mechanization was already reshaping the textile trade across the West Riding. A young man with no land, no established trade, and no settled parish behind him had almost no cushion if the work dried up. Moving somewhere new for steadier work wasn't a small decision. It was often the only card available to play. Aveyard, by the way, that's Aveyard, not Aveyard, the way it looks on the page. It's a real Yorkshire surname, most consecrated around Dewsbury and Wakefield, and the dialect pronunciation is documented in an actual scholarly surname dictionary, which is more than I could say for how I would have guessed it cold, and I'll admit that freely. What the family actually knew about Amos going in was thin. In his early 20s, he shows up in the parish of Muirfield, a few miles from Dewsbury. Not the parish the family always called home. He disappears from Muirfield's records for the following year in 1836. That's it. No death record that fits cleanly anywhere nearby. No marriage that follows. No obvious next chapter. Here's the actual question this episode is chasing, and I want to put it plainly because everything from here forward is in service of answering it. Why did a parish that had no complaint against this man's character or conduct still have the legal power to send him away? And where did that power actually come from? Here's what this man wanted, as far as any of us can reconstruct it from the outside, looking back across nearly 2 centuries. He wanted to stay somewhere, to work, to build something of his own, to not be, in the actual language of the era, removable. That word shows up constantly in these records, printed flatly on official forms as though it were an ordinary administrative category. Imagine finding out your ancestors' whole right to stay somewhere came down to one word on a government form. Here's the part that finally made me open Claude instead of staring at what I had. I didn't need Claude to find a document. I needed help holding 3 pieces of paper in my head at once and asking what they meant together, because on their own, none of them told a story. That's usually the first sign an AI tool belongs in a research problem. Not, I can't find anything. More like, I've found several things and I can't tell if they agree with each other. And that idea, using AI to help you think through what you've already found rather than expecting it to hand you an answer, is the whole spirit behind our golden rule here on the show. AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. It doesn't do the finding for you. It helps you see what you've already found more clearly than you could alone. So here's what I did. And I want you to follow along because this exact approach will work for your own research, English ancestors or not. Here's a distinction that trips people up constantly, and it mattered immediately in this case. Civil registration in England, the GRO, only starts on the 1st of July, 1837. Not around then. That exact date. If your ancestor was born any earlier, there is no GRO birth entry for them anywhere, ever, no matter how carefully you search. Amos was already a grown man working as a laborer by the time the events in this episode happened in 1836, which means his own birth sits on the wrong side of that line entirely. For him, the record we need instead is the parish baptism register. So I searched Find My Past Yorkshire Baptisms Collection, which pulls together parish registers from archives across the Old West Riding for Amos Aviard. I got exactly the kind of mess that record types often hand you. 3 possible baptism entries, all in the right decade, 2 in Muirfield's own register and 1 in neighboring Dewsbury, and nothing in the transcriptions alone that told me which one, if any, grew up into the laborer examined in Muirfield in 1836. So I turned to Claude because what I needed wasn't more searching. It was pattern recognition across results that all looked plausible on their own. Here's exactly what I typed. Quote, I have 3 parish baptism register entries for an Amos Aviard baptized between 1813 and 1817 in West Riding of Yorkshire parishes, 2 in Muirfield and 1 in neighboring Dewsbury. I also have 1 adult record placing Amos Aviard in Muirfield in 1836, occupation laborer. Compare these entries and tell me which baptism details are consistent with each other and which raise questions. I'm trying to identify which baptism entry, if any, is most likely to be the same person as the 1836 adult record, and what additional record would help confirm it, end quote. I chose Claude here because comparing multiple documents side by side and flagging what doesn't line up is exactly what it's built to be good at. And because I could keep feeding it more documents as I found them, without starting the whole comparison over from scratch each time, which matters more than it sounds like when a research thread stretches across several sessions. What came back wasn't a triumphant, here's your answer. It was more careful than that, and honestly, more useful. Claude walked through each baptism entry's parish, date, and named father, and flagged that one of the Muirfield entries listed a father's occupation that didn't fit an agriculture or textile household at all. That narrowed me from 3 candidates to 2. And then it did something I hadn't asked for, which turned out to matter more than what I had asked for. It suggested the parish chest as a place that might record an adult's actual parish of legal settlement directly in plain stated language, rather than me spending hours trying to reverse engineer it backward from a baptism entry written decades before anyone knew it would matter this much. That's your first prompt of the episode. Notice what it didn't do. It didn't pretend to know something it genuinely couldn't know from 3 ambiguous entries and 1 occupation. It narrowed the field honestly and told me exactly where to look next. That's the honest version of what these tools do well, and it's a very different thing from what a lot of people expect going in. Before I moved on, I wanted a second opinion on strategy, not on the documents themselves. So I opened ChatGPT because research strategy brainstorming is exactly where it tends to shine, and archive survival for this kind of material varies so much by county that I didn't want to spend a week searching the wrong catalog entirely. Here's exactly what I typed. Quote, English parishes were legally responsible for their own poor from 1601 onward, and settlement disputes, meaning which parish was legally responsible for a specific person, stayed a parish-level decision until 1865, even after an 1834 reform moved most day-to-day relief into larger poor law unions. Parishes kept records of these settlement examinations and removal orders as part of what's called parish chest material. I'm researching a family in the parish of Muirfield, West Riding of Yorkshire, around 1836. Brainstorm which English archives are most likely to hold surviving parish chest records for Muirfield, and rank them by how completely each one has cataloged that material online versus requiring an in-person visit, end quote. As of this recording, ChatGPT's free tier runs on GPT 5.6 Luna, OpenAI's current lightweight model, with unlimited text conversations, which is honestly a nice change from the message caps that used to interrupt research mid-thought not long ago. What it can't do on the free tier, and I want to be straight with you about this because I got this wrong myself not that long ago, is let you build and save your own custom GPT for repeated use. That's a paid feature now. What you can do for free is exactly what I did here. Give it context, ask a research strategy question, and get a genuinely useful ranked list back. ChatGPT came back with 3 specific archives, ranked by how completely each one catalogs its surviving parish chest material online versus requiring an in-person visit to even find out what exists. That list saved me from guessing blind, and it pointed me straight at the one archive that turned out to actually hold what I needed. This is where it stopped being a record search and turned into something closer to detective work. Because the parish chest is where things finally got specific. Quick explanation. Since you've never heard the term before, it sounds almost decorative. Like something you'd find a museum gift shop. It's not. Every English parish was legally responsible for supporting its own poor, an obligation going back to a Poor Law Act from 1601. But the specific mechanism this episode is built on, actually determining which parish a person legally belonged to and removing them if it wasn't this one, came from a separate, later law, the Settlement Act of 1662. Here's a wrinkle worth knowing if you've read anything about this era. In 1834, there was a big, well-known reform that grouped parishes into larger units called poor law unions. Most people who've heard of Victorian workhouses have heard of that one. What a lot of people don't realize is that settlement itself worked differently. Figuring out which parish was legally responsible for a specific person stayed a parish-by-parish decision for decades longer, all the way to 1865. So when this story happens in 1836, 2 years after that famous reform, it's still individual parishes conducting settlement examinations and issuing removal orders. Exactly like they had for nearly 2 centuries already, going back to that 1662 law. That's why what I found lives in a parish chest and not in some union office's filing system. Here's how it actually worked. The money came from a local tax called the poor rate. Ratepayers in the parish paid it. An appointed official called the overseer of the poor handed it out in answer to a parish meeting called the vestry. So every parish had a real financial reason to know exactly who belonged to it. Supporting the wrong person's poverty cost the parish's own neighbors real money out of their own pockets. When someone new moved in and looked like they might eventually need support, the parish could hold what's called a settlement examination, a formal, recorded interview under oath asking the person to state plainly where they legally belonged. If the answer wasn't this parish, officials could issue a removal order and send that person, sometimes an entire family, back to wherever their legal settlement actually was. I need you to sit with that for a second, because it's a genuinely strange thing to build an entire legal system around. Your home wasn't simply where you lived or where you built a life, or even where you were born. It was a legal status assigned by specific rules, and a parish could invoke that status at any time to make you leave. One more detail worth knowing before we get into the document itself, because it explains why two separate records exist for this same event at all. Removal orders were typically written up in duplicate, one copy for each parish involved, and the person being removed was physically escorted across every parish boundary in between by a constable on foot until he reached the parish that was legally required to take them back. The receiving parish could, in theory, refuse and fight the order. More often, they simply accepted the person and the paperwork closed the case. That's the system Amos walked straight into. I tracked down the archive ChatGPT had pointed me toward, and it held exactly what I was hoping to find. This is where Gemini earned its place in this episode, because what I had wasn't typed text I could paste anywhere. It was a photograph of an 1836 settlement examination written in period handwriting. Looping, inconsistent, cramped into the margins, exactly the kind of script that makes most transcription tools simply give up. Gemini via Google AI Studio remains the tool this show reaches for on handwriting specifically, and for good reason. As of this recording, Gemini 3 Flash is the model to pick in the AI Studio menu. It's free, no subscription required at aistudio.google.com. Now, Google moved the more advanced Pro tier models behind a paid plan earlier this year. You'd think that means the free option is now the compromise option. But current genealogy specific testing shows Flash actually holds its own against Pro on handwriting transcription. Sometimes it even edges Pro out. On legible historical manuscripts, that testing describes the results as close to human level accuracy. That's a genuinely different tier from where AI transcription sat even 2 years ago, when a document like this one would have taken real effort to puzzle through by eye alone. I uploaded the image with a simple, direct prompt. Quote, transcribe this exactly as written, preserve the original line breaks, and flag any individual word you're uncertain about rather than guessing at it, end quote. Here's what came back, and I'm going to read you the part that mattered most. The examination stated, in the parish clerk's own recorded hand, that Amos Aveyard declared his parish of legal settlement to be Thornhill, one of the neighboring parishes bordering Muirfield to the south, a place tied to his father where the older man had served an apprenticeship decades before Amos himself was even born. That's the dead end and the pivot, arriving in the very same sentence. So let me slow all the way down here. Going in, I'd assumed the family story was basically right, missing only a single detail that would fill itself in eventually. Amos moved somewhere for work, hit hard times the way so many did, got sent home to wherever home already meant to everyone involved. What the examination actually showed was that home, in the strict legal sense that mattered to a parish clerk in 1836, was a parish nobody in this family had ever once mentioned. Not the town he was born near, not the town family memory always pointed toward, A third place entirely, connected only through his father's old apprenticeship that 4 generations of oral history had simply let slip away. I want to be honest with you about how I use AI right at this exact moment, because it's precisely where the temptation shows up to let the tool do more than it actually should. Gemini transcribed exactly what was written on the page, nothing more and nothing less. It did not tell me what that meant for this family, or whether the apprenticeship theory made real historical sense, or where I should look next. That part stayed mine, start to finish. And here's my honest opinion on this, for whatever it's worth. A tool that only shows you its source and lets you draw your own conclusion is a tool you can genuinely trust. One that skips straight to the conclusion is one you have to double check anyway, which defeats the entire point of using it in the first place. Which brings me to the second golden rule moment of this episode, and this is the verification kind. AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. Before I let myself get excited about a theory this specific, I needed to check it against a second independent document, not just take Gemini's transcription of one document and run with it. So I took what Gemini transcribed and fed it into Claude alongside a second piece of paper entirely, the removal order itself. Quote, here's a transcription of an 1836 settlement examination stating that Amos Aviard's legal parish of settlement was Thornhill, based on his father's apprenticeship there. I also have a removal order from the same year directing him back to Thornhill. Compare the details in both documents for internal consistency and tell me what specific record types, if surviving, would let me trace the father's apprenticeship claim independently, end quote. Claude compared the two documents and confirmed the parish name and the stated reason match cleanly between them. Two independent records created for different bureaucratic purposes, agreeing on the same specific factual claim. That's exactly the kind of correlation that turns a working theory into actual evidence. It also pointed out something I'd missed entirely on my own. Apprenticeship indentures, when they happen to survive, are themselves part of the parish chest system. Which meant if Thornhill's own chest records had survived the last 2 centuries, the father's original apprenticeship record might still be sitting in a box somewhere waiting. Here's an approach I considered and set aside, because it's worth saying out loud rather than pretending the path forward was obvious from the start. I thought seriously about going straight to the 1841 census for Thornhill, since that's usually the faster path when you're trying to confirm a family moved somewhere. I set it aside for the specific question because a census entry would only confirm the family was physically present in Thornhill. It wouldn't tell me why the settlement claim existed in the first place, or what the parish clerk's actual reasoning was in 1836. The parish chest material was already answering that deeper why directly, and that's what this particular mystery needed most. Here's where we landed. And it's honestly not the ending I expected when I first sat down to research this one. The apprenticeship record for Amos's father did survive. It was sitting in Thornhill's own chest material, dated back to when the father himself was a young man, well before Amos was even born. It confirmed, in plain terms, that the father had indeed served his apprenticeship there. And under the law as it stood at the time, that single documented fact was enough on its own. It established Thornhill, not the family's actual home village, as the legal seat of settlement for the entire family going forward, children included, regardless of where any of them had actually been born or where they'd spent their entire lives up to that point. Amos wasn't sent back to nowhere, the way the family story always implied without quite saying it. He was sent back to a specific place his own family already had a documented legal claim to, decades before he himself had ever set foot there. The record gap in this family's memory didn't erase that claim. It never could. It just sat there quietly, undisturbed, in an archive that most people never think to open in the first place. Go back to that human want I named at the start of this episode. He wanted to stay somewhere. To not be, in the actual legal language of the era, removable. And the records finally tell us why that word applied to him specifically, when it didn't apply to plenty of his neighbors who'd also moved to that parish looking for the same work. It wasn't character, it wasn't conduct. It was a piece of paper signed 2 decades before he was born, in a place he may never have set foot in himself until the day officials sent him there. I keep coming back to that detail, honestly. A man's entire legal home, decided before he existed, by someone else's apprenticeship contract. There's something almost unbearably bureaucratic about it, and also something quietly tragic, and I don't think those two things cancel each other out. They just sit there together, the way they probably did for Amos himself. What we still don't know, and I want to be completely straightforward with you about this rather than smoothing it over for a tidier ending, is what actually happened to Amos after the removal took effect. The trail past 1836 in Thornhill goes cold in the records I've been able to locate so far. No burial entry that clearly matches him. No marriage record that follows cleanly from this point forward. If I kept chasing this one, my next stops would be two places. Thornhill's own later settlement examinations, in case he was examined again somewhere down the line, and the local newspaper archive in case a death or an inquest ever made the column. Maybe he moved on again somewhere else entirely and started over under his own name. Maybe the specific records that would answer this simply didn't survive the centuries in between, the way so much parish material hasn't. Maybe I haven't yet found the right archive holding what remains of him. If there's a family legend sitting in your own tree right now, the kind everybody repeats and nobody's ever actually proven, this is exactly the shape it might take too. Not a lie anyone told on purpose, just a true detail that got separated from its own explanation somewhere around the second or third retelling, waiting in an archive nobody thought to check. Quick recap, because there's genuinely a lot packed into this one. We started by ruling out the GRO index entirely, since Amos was born before civil registration existed and went to parish baptism registers instead. We used Claude to compare ambiguous baptism entries against each other instead of just guessing at which one fit. ChatGPT pointed us towards the right archive before we wasted a week searching the wrong one entirely. Gemini transcribed a settlement examination that named a parish nobody in this family had remembered in generations. And Claude, a second time, checked that examination against a removal order to figure out exactly what to chase next. Your homework. If you've got English ancestors anywhere in your tree, look up whether their parish has surviving parish chest material sitting in a county record office somewhere. Most county archive websites let you search their catalog remotely before you ever have to travel, so start there. Even if nobody in your family story ever needed poor relief, not once, because settlement disputes reached far further into ordinary families than most people ever expect. It wasn't only the desperately poor who ended up examined. Anyone who moved parishes for work, married outside their home parish, or took on an apprenticeship somewhere new could end up with a settlement question attached to their name, and that question could outlive them by generations without anyone noticing. I've wanted to do a full episode set entirely in England for a long time now, and this one made the wait worth it. And for my Australian and UK listeners, today's techniques translate directly to your own research. UK researchers, this episode basically was your home turf from start to finish. Check whether the National Archives or your county record office holds surviving parish chest material for your ancestors' specific parish, and search the GRO's own index directly at gro.gov.uk rather than assuming free BMD already has the complete picture for your family. Australian researchers working on English origin ancestors should know that many English county records offices will still do limited paid lookups by post if you can't travel to check yourself, and Trove remains well worth checking for newspaper mentions of arrivals from a specific English parish. Thank you so much for listening to Ancestors and Algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you know a fellow genealogist who could benefit from what we covered today, share this episode with them. That is the best way to help our community grow. If today resonated, the companion guide takes it one step further. I include the exact multi-step workflow I use for tracing a settlement dispute all the way through parish chest material, plus advanced prompts and a GPS research checklist tailored specifically to English civil and parish records. The free episode stands on its own, but the companion guide is where the serious toolkit lives. For everything you need, including every episode, our private Facebook community, companion guides, and the research lab, head over to ancestorsandai.com. It's all right there waiting for you. I'm your host, Brian, and I will see you next week for another journey into the past, powered by the future. Until then, happy researching.